What if I told you that our species, Homo sapiens, isn't as unique as we like to believe? That once upon a time, not millions of years ago, but just a geological blink of an eye, there were other humans walking the earth. And some of them were so strange, so utterly out of place, that they looked as if they had stepped out of a time machine, carrying the body of an ancient ancestor, but the brain of a modern relative. One of those strange beings lived not on a faraway island, not in some remote corner of the world, but right in the heart of Africa, our birthplace. This species was small, tiny, really. Imagine an adult who barely reached your shoulders. Imagine someone weighing no more than a middle school kid, with delicate bones but oddly powerful hands. A creature that could climb like a chimpanzee, yet walked like us. And to make things stranger, its brain was no bigger than that of a toddler. And yet, some scientists believe it may have understood death, may have cared for its dead, and may have practiced the earliest burials in human history. This is the story of Homo naledi, discovered deep within one of the most dangerous cave systems in South Africa. Homo naledi has become one of the greatest mysteries in the history of human evolution. It has forced us to rethink what it means to be human, to question whether intelligence and culture really require a big brain, and to reconsider whether we are truly the only humans who ever mattered. But before we descend into the dark, twisting tunnels of the Rising Star Cave, where their bones were found, we need to take a step back to understand just how bizarre this discovery is. You first have to know something that most people don't. We are not, and never have been, the only humans. For much of our lives, we're told a simple story. It goes something like this. Once upon a time, our ape-like ancestors learned to walk upright, gradually became smarter, discovered fire, invented tools, and eventually, after millions of years, became us. One long ladder, rung after rung, step after step, marching toward modernity. It's a comforting story, a story of progress, inevitability, and triumph. But it's also completely wrong. The truth looks nothing like a ladder. Instead, picture a bush, a wild, tangled bush with many branches growing in different directions. Some branches flourish, others wither, and many grow side by side. That's what human evolution really looks like. At least a dozen different species of humans have existed. Some were tall, some short, some had big brains, others small. Some were explorers who spread across continents, while others stayed rooted to one small place. And here's the kicker. For much of our history, multiple human species lived at the same time. We were never alone. Even as recently as 40,000 years ago, we shared the world with Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, and the so-called hobbits of Indonesia. And if you go further back, to about 300,000 years ago, the time when the first Homo sapiens were just emerging, the planet was full of different humans. In Africa alone, there were Homo heidelbergensis, perhaps still lingering. In Europe, Neanderthals were already thriving. In Asia, Homo erectus may have survived in isolated pockets. And in South Africa, hidden away in a cave system that would remain unexplored for hundreds of thousands of years, there lived Homo naledi. The name naledi means star in the local Sotho language, a reference to the Rising Star Cave where their remains were found. But for many scientists, the nickname stuck in another form, the Star People. Almost poetic, for a species that continues to shine light on one of the darkest corners of our past. But to call them people is already controversial. Were they really human? Or were they something else entirely too primitive to be considered one of us? Too strange to be a true cousin? That's the debate. On the surface, their anatomy seems like a cruel joke. They look like a mashup of ancient ancestors and modern humans, as if nature itself had pulled random traits from different eras and stitched them together. Their skulls are small, their bodies tiny, their shoulders hunched like apes. Yet their legs, feet, and even parts of their hands look eerily familiar. They walked upright. They moved like us. In some ways, they even thought like us. And here's the strangest part. They weren't ancient. They didn't live 2 million years ago, when such features would have made sense. They lived less than 300,000 000 years ago at the same time as early Homo sapiens. In evolutionary terms, they were our neighbors. Imagine that. While our ancestors in Africa were inventing new stone tools, painting caves, and maybe even telling the first stories, these tiny, small-brained humans were climbing trees, digging up roots, and perhaps performing burials in pitch-black caverns. Two different kinds of human, alive in the same world. That realization alone forces us to stop and think. What does it mean to be human? Is it brain size? Is it technology? Is it culture? Art? Language? Or is it something deeper? Something that species like Homo naledi might have shared with us, even if they didn't look or think exactly the same? So, let's dive in. Over the next several chapters, I'll take you on a journey. We'll descend into the Rising Star Cave, where the bones of at least 15 Homo naledi individuals lay hidden for hundreds of millennia. We'll explore their anatomy, their tiny frames, their powerful hands, their bizarre teeth, and their curious brains. We'll ask whether these small humans had the spark of intelligence that makes us who we are, and whether they truly buried their dead in rituals that predate anything else in the human record. We'll examine how they lived, what they ate, what dangers they faced, and why they ultimately disappeared. And finally, we'll wrestle with the bigger questions. What does their existence mean for us? For our story? For the very definition of being human? Because if Homo naledi proves anything, it's that the human story is far stranger and far richer than the simple ladder we were all taught in school. And if you're ready, let's begin. Our story takes us to South Africa, not far from the bustling city of Johannesburg. Beneath the rolling hills and scrublands of the cradle of humankind, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, known for its astonishing fossil record, lies a cave system so treacherous, so claustrophobic, that for decades no one dared to fully explore it. It's called the Rising Star Cave, and if there was ever a place on Earth designed to test human endurance, patience, and courage, this is it. In 2013, two recreational cavers, Rick Hunter and Stephen Tucker, decided to push deeper into Rising Star than anyone had before. The cave is a labyrinth, winding tunnels, steep drops, and narrow squeezes that seem to close in on you like a vice. It's pitch black inside, the kind of darkness where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. The air is stale, the rocks are jagged, the walls feel alive, pressing against you, reminding you that you do not belong here. As Hunter and Tucker wriggled through one impossibly tight passage, barely able to move their arms, they entered a small chamber, and that's when they saw it. Bones. Lots of bones. Human-looking bones. At first, they thought they had stumbled into the grave of some unfortunate explorers. But the bones looked old, very old. When they brought back word, paleoanthropologist Lee Berger from the University of the Witwatersrand immediately realized the potential. Berger had been searching for new human fossils in South Africa for years, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The chamber was so difficult to access that Berger himself couldn't even fit through the narrow passage. So he put out an unusual call on social media. He needed scientists who were not only trained in archaeology and paleoanthropology, but also small, slender, and experienced in caving. He called them underground astronauts. Within weeks, a team of 6 women, all thin enough to squeeze through the tight passages, were selected. They were climbers, spelunkers, scientists, and adventurers rolled into one. And their mission was simple but dangerous: recover the bones from the chamber. The chamber itself became known as the Naledi Chamber, Chamber of Stars. To get there, the team had to crawl through a crack just 18 centimeters wide. That's about the width of your head. One wrong move, and you could get stuck. Once inside, the chamber opened up, but only slightly. Enough for a few people to crouch and work, but not much more. And scattered across the floor were bones. Not just a few, not 1 or 2, but hundreds. Over the course of multiple expeditions, the team recovered more than 500 fossil specimens, representing at least 15 individuals, adults, children, even infants, men and women alike. The bones were astonishingly well preserved. Skulls, jaws, ribs, hands, feet, enough to reconstruct entire skeletons. And as the scientists examined them, one thing became clear: these were not modern humans. Dating the bones was tricky. The chamber was sealed off, with no easy way for sediment to flow in. But eventually, using advanced techniques, the fossils were dated to between 335,000 and 236,000 years ago. And that's when the real shock set in. Because at that time, Homo sapiens, our species, already existed. In fact, fossils of early humans from Morocco date to around 315,000 years ago, which meant that Homo naledi and Homo sapiens were contemporaries. They shared the same world. But Homo naledi didn't look like us at all. Imagine being one of the scientists in that chamber. You're holding a skull that looks like it belongs to an ancestor from nearly 2 million years ago. But the dating tells you this skull is young, far younger than it has any right to be. It's like finding a dinosaur fossil that turns out to be only 10,000 years old. It doesn't make sense. And so, from the very beginning, Homo naledi was a paradox, a species that shouldn't exist, at least not in that time and place. But the discovery didn't just raise questions about anatomy. The biggest mystery was, how did the bones get there? The Naledi chamber is so inaccessible that it's hard to imagine a group of humans simply living there. There's no evidence of habitational tools, no fire, no food remains. The chamber isn't the kind of place you stumble into by accident. Either. The path is far too narrow and complex. And yet, over 15 individuals ended up in the exact same spot. There were no signs of trauma on the bones, no bite marks from predators, no evidence of a catastrophic collapse. So what happened? Lee Berger and his team proposed a radical idea. Maybe Homo naledi had deliberately placed their dead in the chamber. If true, this would mean they practiced burial behavior, something previously thought to be unique to big-brained humans like Neanderthals and us. But remember, Homo naledi had brains half the size of ours. By traditional thinking, they shouldn't have been capable of such complex, symbolic behavior. And yet, the evidence pointed that way. Imagine it. Small, slender humans, carrying the bodies of their loved ones into the darkness, crawling through the narrow passage, navigating in pitch black, placing the dead in a hidden chamber where predators couldn't reach them. If that's what happened, then Homo naledi may have been the first humans in history to bury their dead. And that single possibility has shaken anthropology to its core. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some scientists argue the bones could have washed in, or that the individuals simply got trapped. But the sheer number of bodies, and the lack of evidence for accidents or predators, makes those explanations less convincing. The mystery remains unsolved. But what cannot be denied is this: Rising Star gave us one of the richest fossil collections ever found, and with it, the key to one of the strangest chapters in human evolution. And as the team pieced together the skeletons, the true strangeness of Homo naledi began to reveal itself. Because while their bones were young in age, their anatomy looked ancient, yet with a few disturbingly familiar features. They were a mosaic, a collage, a puzzle with pieces borrowed from different times. And that puzzle is what we're going to explore next. When the bones from the Rising Star cave were first laid out on the lab tables, the scientists couldn't believe what they were looking at. It was as if someone had opened a drawer full of human skeletons, shuffled the bones like a deck of cards, and then scattered them back out in a completely random order. Because Homo naledi didn't look like one thing. They looked like everything, like a mashup of different human species. Some ancient, some modern, stitched together in a body that shouldn't exist. Let's start with their size. The average adult Homo naledi stood about 143 centimeters tall, that's 4 feet, 9 inches, in weight. They tipped the scale at under 90 pounds. To put that in perspective, that's about the size of a middle school child today. Imagine running into a full-grown adult who looks like a kid wearing grown-up features. Short, slim, almost delicate. And yet, their bones weren't weak. Their frames were light. Yes, but built for endurance. They weren't fragile creatures destined to break under pressure, they were survivors. adapted for a lifestyle that blended the old and the new. Now let's look at their hands. If you glance quickly, their wrists and thumbs look surprisingly familiar. Strong, robust thumbs similar to ours, and to Neanderthal, suggesting they had the ability to grip objects firmly. That's the kind of adaptation you expect in a toolmaker. Someone who can hammer, shape, cut, and build. But then you notice the fingers. Each finger was long and dramatically curved. Not like ours at all. In fact, their fingers were even more curved than those of some earlier hominins. Like the Australopithecines famous group that included Lucy, our 3 million-year-old ancestor. What does that mean? Curved fingers are for climbing. They're hooks designed for grasping tree branches. Imagine a rock climber's hand strong, curved, built to hang on. That's what Homo naledi had, but even more extreme. So here's the paradox. Their hands looked like they belonged to both a modern human and an ancient ape, capable of delicate manipulation, but also perfectly built for a life among the trees. And it wasn't just their hands. Their shoulders sloped upward and outward, like those of apes. Their rib cage was shaped more like that of early hominins, narrow at the top, flaring out below. Their pelvis, the bones that support our hips, was also primitive, resembling those of species millions of years older. Taken together, these features suggested a body built for climbing, scrambling, pulling itself upward into trees. In other words, they weren't fully committed to life on the ground. They were still, in some sense, creatures of the forest canopy. And yet, their legs told a completely different story. If you examine their lower limbs, you find broad kneecaps, strong but muscle attachments, and long tibiaceal traits associated with walking upright over long distances. Their feet looked astonishingly modern. They had arches like ours, toes aligned for bipedal walking, and heel bones designed for endurance walking. When paleoanthropologists reconstructed their gait, they concluded that Homo naledi would have walked almost exactly like us. If you saw them moving at a distance, striding across the savanna, you'd think you were watching a small, oddly built human, but human nonetheless. So once again, we have a contradiction. A species that was both a tree climber and a long-distance walker. A species that seemed to belong both to the forests and to the open plains. Why? Some scientists believe this combination of traits was an adaptation to South Africa's environment at the time. The landscape was patchy trees scattered among grasslands. Climbing gave them safety from predators, while walking gave them mobility when resources ran out. They were, quite literally, stuck between two worlds. Then there are their teeth. At first glance, their teeth were small, especially compared to their jaw size. But the enamel, the tough outer coating, was unusually thick, more like that of older hominins. Why would a relatively young species retain such an ancient feature? The answer might lie in their diet. The wear patterns on their molars suggest they were eating tough, gritty foods, roots, tubers, things dug from the ground and covered in dirt. That kind of diet wears down teeth quickly. Thick enamel would have been an advantage, but there was a cost. Many of the Homo naledi specimens showed signs of dental disease, abscesses, and heavy wear. Their food was functional, but it wasn't exactly good for their long-term health. So far, the picture we have is of a small-bodied, lightweight human with ape-like climbing abilities, modern walking skills, and a rough diet. A strange but workable combination. But the real mystery, the thing that truly stunned scientists, was not their bones or their teeth. It was their brains. The skulls of Homo naledi revealed brain volumes ranging from 465 to 610 cubic centimeters. To put that in context, modern human brains average around 350 cubic centimeters. Neanderthals had even larger brains, sometimes bigger than ours. Even early Homo erectus, nearly 2 million years old, had brains larger than Homo naledi. By brain size alone, Homo naledi looked primitive, more like a species from 2 million years ago than from 300,000 years ago. But size isn't everything. The shape of the brain case revealed something astonishing. Despite being small, the brain of Homo naledi had features associated with later humans' developed frontal lobes, expanded temporal regions, and a reduced narrowing behind the eyes. In plain English, their brains looked structured for complex thought. This raised a chilling question. Could these tiny-brained humans have been smarter than we thought? If so, it breaks one of the longest-standing assumptions in anthropology that intelligence scales with brain size. Traditionally, we think bigger brains mean more smarts. Chimps have small brains, so they're less intelligent. Humans have big brains, so we dominate the world. But Homo naledi sat there, in the middle, defying that logic. With a brain half our size, they might have been capable of behaviors once thought exclusive to big-brained species like symbolic thought, social complexity, maybe even language. And when you remember that their bones were found deep inside a nearly inaccessible cave chamber, possibly deliberately placed there, the possibility becomes even harder to ignore. A small brain does not necessarily mean a simple mind. One more detail is worth noting. The way their teeth grew and developed followed a pattern similar to modern humans. Not quite identical, but close enough to raise eyebrows. It suggests that despite their small size and archaic body, Homo naledi might have shared more in common with us than we'd like to admit. So where does that leave us? With a species that is both old and new, primitive and modern. A species that confounds the idea of a straight line from ape to human. They were short but strong. Climbers, but walkers. Small-brained, but maybe thoughtful. Survivors in a harsh world. And perhaps most importantly, they force us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that intelligence and humanity are not the same thing. That you can look very different. Think with a smaller brain. Live in harsher conditions. And still, in some way, be human. In the next part of our journey, we'll go deeper into that question. Because if Homo naledi really did carry their dead into the rising star cave, it changes everything. It would mean they weren't just climbing trees and digging for roots. They were also grappling with the meaning of life and death. And that would make them not just strange cousins but fellow humans. In every sense of the word. If the skeletons of Homo naledi shocked scientists with their strange anatomy, the way those skeletons were found pushed the shock into something far deeper. Something almost unsettling. Because the bones weren't scattered across the African plains, where predators or floods could explain their placement. They weren't lying at the mouth of a cave, where ancient humans might have accidentally fallen in. No, they were in a secret chamber. A chamber so hidden, so impossible to reach, that even today experienced cavers have to fight claustrophobia and panic just to get inside. And yet, more than 15 Homo naledi individuals ended up there. How? The simplest answer is often the one scientists reach for first. Maybe they fell. But there's no vertical shaft leading directly into the chamber. No chute that could funnel bodies inside. Maybe predators dragged them in. But there are no bite marks on the bones. No evidence of gnawing. No fossilized remains of carnivores nearby. Maybe water washed them in during floods? But the chamber is too isolated. Too sealed. No signs of sediment flow match that explanation. Piece by piece, the easy answers fell away, which left a much harder possibility. Maybe Homo naledi put themselves there. Or rather, maybe the living placed the dead there. When Lee Berger first suggested this, the idea was almost laughed at. Burial behavior had long been considered the domain of big-brained humans. Neanderthals buried their dead. Early Homo sapiens buried theirs. But a creature with a brain barely half the size of ours? That didn't fit the narrative. And yet, the evidence kept pointing back to it. Imagine the scene. A small community of Homo naledi loses one of its own. Perhaps a mother, or a child, or an elder. Their fragile body is carried not into the open air, but into darkness. Step by step, the survivors squeeze through the crack, maneuvering the body through passages so narrow that even today, most modern humans can't pass without training. They move in total blackness, maybe guided by touch, maybe by some form of light we haven't yet found evidence for. And then, deep within the earth, they place the body down, not buried under soil, not entombed with tools or artifacts, but left in a hidden chamber where it will rest, safe from predators and scavengers. It sounds almost human, doesn't it? If that is truly what happened. Then Homo naledi didn't just dispose of their dead. They engaged in a behavior loaded with meaning. Even at its most basic, burial signals recognition of death. It signals that the body is not just meat, not just waste to be discarded, but something that matters. It hints at care, at grief, maybe even at belief. In us, burial is tied to memory, ritual, and the beginnings of culture. Could a small-brained species have crossed that threshold too? Skeptics push back. They argue that we're reading too much into bones in a cave, that without clear signs of ritual tools, carvings, offerings who can't assume meaning. And they're right to be cautious. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. But here's the thing. Even if it wasn't ritual in the way we imagine, even if it was simply a practical decision, let's place the bodies where predators won't find them. It still shows foresight, planning, social cooperation, a recognition that the dead are different from the living. And for a species with a brain the size of a grapefruit, that's extraordinary enough. This possibility raises another fascinating question. How did they navigate the cave? The Naledi chamber isn't accessible without tools. Even today, cavers bring headlamps, ropes, and climbing gear. Could Homo naledi have used torches? Fire? Did they communicate, organize, and coordinate to move bodies safely into the depths? No torches or fire remains have been found in the chamber. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Fire doesn't always leave obvious traces. If they did use fire, it would mean they had mastered one of the most powerful tools in human history. And if they didn't, then they managed to navigate total darkness using only touch and memory, which is almost more impressive. The implications are staggering. For centuries, scientists assumed that symbolic behavior ritual, burial, art was tied to brain size. Only species with big brains could think abstractly, plan for the future, and grapple with concepts like death. But Homo naledi sits there in the shadows, saying otherwise. They remind us that intelligence is not linear, that the human mind may be far more flexible, more creative than we once believed. And burial might not have been the only hint of their intelligence. The shape of their brains, as we saw earlier, suggested capacity for language. Their thumbs suggested tool-making. Their endurance bodies suggested travel. Yet no tools have been found in Rising Star. It's possible they didn't use tools at all, unlikely. But possible. Or maybe they used tools made of wood, fiber, or other materials that don't survive in the fossil record. Stone tools are durable. Wooden spears and digging sticks vanish with time. And remember, other humans around this time, including early Homo sapiens, were making Middle Stone Age tools in Africa. It's possible Homo naledi saw, learned, or even traded ideas with them. We may never know for sure. But the thought that two species of humans, one with a large brain, one with a small, were both shaping the world in their own ways is tantalizing. Another clue comes from the diversity of individuals in the chamber. The fossils include males and females, young and old. This wasn't just one tragic accident where a group fell in. It was a pattern repeated over time, a community returning again and again to the same place. That consistency suggests cultural behavior, a tradition, a shared understanding passed from one generation to the next. And culture is one of the defining traits of being human. So, what kind of minds were these? Some scientists argue they were different kinds of smart. Not like us, not like Neanderthals, but their own unique brand of intelligence. Maybe their small brains forced them to think differently, faster in some ways, more specialized in others. Others suggest we're underestimating them completely. That brain size doesn't matter nearly as much as structure. That Homo naledi may have had intelligence surprisingly close to ours, hidden behind their small skulls. Whichever is true, one fact is undeniable. They weren't mindless. They weren't animals. They were humans, however strange. And yet, intelligence doesn't always guarantee survival. For all their possible rituals, their clever hands, their endurance, Homo naledi still vanished. Their time on Earth was brief, maybe 100,000 years. A blink compared to other species. But in that blink, they left behind a puzzle so profound that it still unsettles us today. In the next chapter, we'll step out of the cave and into the world they lived in. A South Africa of shifting climates, harsh seasons, predators lurking in the shadows, and a fragile species struggling to find its place. Because to understand Homo naledi, it's not enough to look at their bones. We have to imagine the world they faced every day and why. In the end, they couldn't hold on. To understand Homo naledi, we can't just look at their bones in a lab. We have to imagine the world they inhabited, the air they breathed, the dangers they faced, the choices that shaped their brief existence. Because life for these small humans was anything but easy. Picture South Africa 300,000 years ago. The land was not the lush, green paradise we might imagine. It was a landscape in transition. Forests were shrinking, replaced by open savannas. The climate swung between wet and dry, hot and cold, in cycles that could devastate food supplies. For Homo naledi, standing barely 5 feet tall and weighing less than 90 pounds, survival meant navigating this unpredictable world day after day. Predators lurked everywhere. Lions, leopards, and hyenas were common. These weren't the same species we see today, but their ancestors were every bit as deadly and often larger. To a small-bodied human, a lion wasn't just a threat. It was an apex hunter that could take you down in a heartbeat. Leopards could drag prey into trees. Hyenas hunted in packs and could overpower almost anything. And Homo naledi had no spears, no bows, no fortresses. Their best defense may have been their climbing ability. Those long, curved fingers weren't just for show, they could mean the difference between life and death. Scrambling up a tree at the last second, clinging to a branch while a predator prowled below. But even that wasn't foolproof. Predators climbed too, and in an open savanna with fewer trees, escape routes were limited. Food was another challenge. The wear on their teeth tells a grim story. These people ate roots, tubers, and underground plants, foods tough to chew, filled with grit, and often dirty. They may have eaten small animals, berries, or insects too, but the dental damage suggests a diet heavy and hard. Fibrous plants. It wasn't gourmet dining. It was survival food. Thick enamel protected their teeth. But even so, many individuals suffered from cavities, abscesses, and severe wear. Imagine chewing on gritty roots until your gums swelled and your teeth cracked. That was daily life. And then there was the climate. South Africa in this era wasn't stable. Harsh winters, burning summers, sudden droughts all left their mark on the fossils. The teeth of Homo naledi show growth interruptions, tiny lines that form when development is disrupted by malnutrition or illness. In other words, even as children, they suffered. Some grew up hungry. Some never grew up at all. The small body size of Homo naledi may not just have been evolutionary, it may also have been survival. A smaller body needs fewer calories. It's easier to keep alive in times of scarcity, but it also makes you more vulnerable to the cold, less able to store fat, and more likely to fall prey to larger animals. Life was a constant balancing act. Illness added another layer of hardship. Even today, the region around the Rising Star Cave is prone to respiratory diseases, flu, and childhood sickness. For a fragile species with no medicine, no fire-warm shelters, and no doctors, even a common cold could turn deadly. Archaeologists found signs of disease and injury in the fossils. Healed fractures suggested accidents, falls from trees, tumbles on rocks, that individuals survived only with the help of others. Which raises an important point. They must have cared for each other. A broken bone in the wild is often a death sentence unless your community supports you. The fact that some Homo naledi survived such injuries means they weren't alone. They had companionship, cooperation, and some form of compassion. But in the end, compassion alone couldn't save them. Their world was volatile, their bodies small, their brains puzzlingly different. Over a span of roughly 100,000 years, they held on. But eventually, the odds stacked too high against them. So what finally did them in? There are a few theories. Climate change, as Africa grew drier and more variable. Resources dwindled. Larger, better equipped humans could migrate to new regions. adapt to new diets, and use technology to survive. Homo naledi may have been stuck, unable to escape their shrinking niche. Competition around the same time. Other humans were on the rise: Homo sapiens in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe, and maybe even Homo heidelbergensis still lingering. With larger brains and better tools, they would have outcompeted Homo naledi for food, shelter, and territory. Predation and disease. Small populations are fragile. A few bad seasons, a predator outbreak, or an epidemic could wipe them out. Isolation. Rising Star Cave may have been both sanctuary and prison. If their community was too small, genetic diversity would decline. Over time, inbreeding weakens a species. Most likely, it was all of the above, a perfect storm of pressures that overwhelmed them. And yet, there's something strangely hopeful in their story. Despite their challenges, they survived for 100,000 years. They adapted. They found ways to live, to eat, to climb, to walk, to cooperate. And if the burial theory is true, they even found ways to remember their dead. That's not the mark of a failure. That's the mark of a survivor, of a human, however different. So picture them one last time in their world. A small band of people moving across the savannah, scanning for roots and tubers, children darting among the rocks, adults keeping watch for lions on the horizon. At night, they may have huddled together for warmth, sleeping in caves or in trees. Their hands, curved like hooks, pulled them upward into safety. Their eyes scanned the darkness for danger. Their minds small, yes, but not simple, held memories of loss, of companionship, of survival. They were strange. They were small. They were fragile. But they were human. And then, one day, they were gone. Their disappearance is a reminder that humanity is not guaranteed. That intelligence, compassion, and adaptability don't always lead to survival. That dozens of species once walked this earth, and we are the only ones left. It could easily have been otherwise. Homo naledi might have thrived, and we might have been the ones remembered only in fossils. Instead, we carry the legacy of all those lost cousins, their experiments in survival, their triumphs and failures, their strange, tangled existence. In the next chapter, we'll ask the biggest question of all: where exactly do they fit on our family tree? Because if their bodies look ancient but their age is young, if their brains are small but their minds may have been complex, then who were they, really? And what do they mean for the story of us? When the dust settled after the rising star discovery, when the bones were cleaned, cataloged, and measured, one haunting question remained. Where, exactly, does Homo naledi belong on our family tree? For over a century, anthropologists have tried to draw neat lines through human evolution. They wanted a clean genealogy, like a family scrapbook where you can point to great-great-grandmother Australopithecus and Uncle Neanderthal. But every time we think we have the story straight, fossils like Homo naledi tear it apart. Because Homo naledi doesn't fit. They don't look like they should exist 300,000 years ago. Their bodies are part ancient, part modern. Their brains are small, yet oddly advanced in shape. Their behavior may have been complex, or maybe not. So scientists have proposed several competing hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, an early branch. Some believe Homo naledi branched off from the human line very early, perhaps nearly 2 million years ago. They may have been a relic species, evolving in isolation long after their cousins had moved on. If this is true, then Homo naledi are like living fossils, an ancient form of human that somehow survived into surprisingly recent times, hiding in their ecological niche while other humans rose and fell. It would be as if a small group of Australopithecines had survived undetected for 1 million years, frozen in time. Hypothesis 2, a hybrid species. Another idea is that Homo naledi may be the product of interbreeding between early humans and more ancient hominids. In recent years, we've learned that interbreeding was common. Homo sapiens mated with Neanderthals, Neanderthals with Denisovans, Denisovans with yet another mysterious group. Genes flowed back and forth like rivers, joining and splitting. So why not Homo naledi? Perhaps they were born from a hybrid event, two very different species coming together, producing a strange but viable population that carried on in South Africa. This would explain their mosaic anatomy, their blend of ancient and modern traits. Hypothesis 3. A sister of Homo erectus. Some features of their skulls, especially the way their brow ridges and cranial shapes align, suggest a link to Homo erectus. Homo erectus was one of the most successful humans ever, spreading from Africa to Asia and surviving for nearly 2 million years. Maybe Homo naledi was a small offshoot of this mighty species, cut off in South Africa, shrinking in size, adapting to new pressures. If so, they might represent a localized experiment in evolution, parallel to but separate from our line. Hypothesis 4. A sister of Homo heidelbergensis. Others point to similarities with Homo heidelbergensis, a species that lived around 600,000 years ago and may have been the ancestor of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Perhaps Homo naledi was a side branch, closely related but ultimately distinct, splitting off and pursuing its own path. Which hypothesis is right? The truth is we don't know. Every time a new study is published, every time a new bone is analyzed, the picture shifts. Homo naledi refuses to be pinned down. And maybe that's the lesson. Evolution is not neat. It's not clean. It doesn't obey the stories we like to tell ourselves. It's messy, chaotic, full of dead ends, side paths, and strange experiments. But let's zoom out. Beyond the technical debates about bones and branches, what does Homo naledi really mean for us? First, they remind us that big brains aren't everything. For decades, we assumed intelligence was tied to brain size. But here's a species with a brain half the size of ours, maybe practicing burial, maybe caring for their dead. They force us to rethink what intelligence is. Maybe it's not just about size, but about structure. Maybe it's not just about neurons, but about cooperation, culture, and adaptation. Maybe being human is not about having the biggest brain, but about using whatever brain you have in the most creative ways. Second, they remind us that we were never alone. The image of lone Homo sapiens conquering the earth is a myth. For most of history, we lived side by side with other humans, Neanderthal, Denisovans, Flores hobbits, and yes, Homo naledi. At times we competed. At times we interbred. At times we may have simply ignored each other, living parallel lives. We are not the inevitable outcome of evolution. We are survivors of a much larger family, most of which is now gone. Third, they remind us that fragility and resilience go hand in hand. By every measure, Homo naledi should not have survived. They were small, vulnerable, living in a harsh, predator-filled world. And yet, they did survive perhaps for 100,000 years, long enough to raise children, care for their sick, bury their dead, long enough to leave a mark so deep that we are still talking about them today. That is resilience. That is humanity. Finally, they remind us of our own precariousness. If Homo naledi and Neanderthals, and Denisovans, and all the rest could vanish, so could we. Intelligence is no guarantee. Technology is no guarantee. Dominance is no guarantee. We are here today not because we were destined to be, but because chance, luck, and circumstance allowed us to survive while others did not. And that realization should humble us. So, who was Homo naledi? They were us, and not us. They were human, and something else. They were a paradox that forces us to see our story not as a straight line, but as a tangled web. They were the star people, small, strange, fragile, resilient, and maybe, just maybe, they carried in their tiny brains the first sparks of what makes us human: memory, care, belief. Imagine standing at the mouth of the rising star cave today, the African sun blazing overhead, the entrance yawning dark below, and knowing that deep in that darkness lies a story that will never fully be told. A story of a species that looked up at the stars, buried their dead in the earth, and vanished into mystery, but left behind a message, carved not in stone but in bone, that humanity has never been one thing. It has always been many, and that the definition of human is far wider, stranger, and more beautiful than we ever imagined. So the next time you look in the mirror and see yourself as the pinnacle of evolution, remember, once upon a time, in the same land that gave birth to us, lived another kind of human. They were small. They were strange. They are gone. But in their story, we see the truth. We are just one branch of a vast, tangled tree, and that tree is still full of secrets waiting to be found. So, what do we do with the mystery of Homo naledi? Were they really the first humans to bury their dead, proving that even with a tiny brain, they carried thoughts of memory, grief, maybe even belief? Or are we simply projecting our own humanity onto them, reading meaning into bones scattered in the dark? Did they climb trees to escape predators, or to watch the stars from above? Did they share stories by firelight that we'll never hear? Did they look at their children and see a future they would never live to witness? We may never know the answers, but one thing is clear: they were human. Different from us, yes, but human nonetheless. And their story is a reminder that our family tree is far stranger and far richer than we were ever taught in school. Now I want to hear from you. Backhand index pointing right, do you think Homo naledi truly understood death and deliberately placed their dead in the rising star cave? Or was it all just a coincidence of nature? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to see what you think. And if you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten branches of our human family, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell, because there are still so many more mysteries of our ancient cousins waiting to be told. This was the story of Homo naledi, the star people, the strangest humans we've ever found. And until next time, stay curious.